Wimsey, whose attention had apparently drifted to the Persian carpet beneath his feet, which was, he noted with interest, of quite remarkable quality, and wore certain signs of careful restoration along its eastern edge, looked up with the expression of a man suddenly recalled from contemplation of something vastly more engaging than murder. How very tidy, he observed, with what Mrs. Ashworth evidently took for criticism, for she stiffened almost imperceptibly. I mean to say, how extraordinarily methodical, a routine of 15 years, unvaried and perfect. One might suppose Miss Weatherby was the very soul of predictability. He rose and walked to the window with the lazy grace of a man unbothered by the conventions of drawing-room visiting, peering out across the gardens with his hands clasped behind his back. "Tell me, Mrs. Ashworth, this morning room, is it a room in which one might reasonably expect privacy, or does one encounter a certain traffic of domestic personnel?" Mrs. Ashworth, somewhat nonplussed by this apparent tangent, replied that the morning room was indeed a room of considerable privacy. It was situated at the far end of the eastern corridor, away from the principal rooms of the house, and was used almost exclusively by Miss Weatherby for her correspondence and needlework. The servants rarely had occasion to pass through it, save for Mrs. Craddock bringing the morning coffee, and, occasionally, the housemaid Jenny to attend to the fires. "And this Jenny," Wimsey continued, turning to face his hostess with an expression of mild curiosity, "has she been in your employ long? Does she strike you as a girl of particular intelligence, or conversely, as the sort who might be induced to perform small tasks without inquiring too closely into their nature?" "Jenny has been here 8 years," Mrs. Ashworth replied, her voice acquiring a note of defensiveness. "She is a capable girl, if rather quiet. She certainly had no reason to harm Arabella. They barely knew one another, save in the professional capacity of mistress and servant." Wimsey nodded, as though this were precisely the response he had anticipated, though something in his expression suggested he found it rather less than satisfying. He returned to his chair and adopted an attitude of relaxed attention, his long fingers steepled beneath his chin, a gesture that had a peculiar effect of making otherwise intelligent people feel suddenly inarticulate. Now, as to the arsenic itself, Inspector Graves examined the coffee pot, you say, and found nothing? No residue upon the rim, no peculiar discoloration of the interior, no faint smell of bitter almonds, though I confess the olfactory detection of cyanide is rather more reliable than arsenic, which possesses a smell rather less convenient for murder detection. There was nothing, Mrs. Ashworth confirmed. The pot was perfectly ordinary. It had been used that very morning, and Mrs. Craddock swears upon her children's lives that she prepared it in the usual manner. "How very interesting," Wimsey murmured, and there was something in his tone that suggested he found it indeed fascinating, though precisely what fascinated him remained obscure. And the cup itself, the one from which Miss Weatherby drank, did it bear any marks of tampering, cracks, chips, discolorations? You see, arsenic, while moderately soluble in hot liquid, does have a tendency to settle rather stubbornly if one is not sufficiently attentive to the matter of stirring. The cup was examined with great care, Mrs. Ashworth assured him, with the air of one reporting facts rather than speculation. It was a perfectly ordinary piece of china, part of a set that has been in use in this house for 20 years. There was nothing unusual about it whatsoever. Wimsey fell silent for a moment, his expression turning inward as though he were conducting some sort of internal calculation. When he spoke again, his voice had taken on a note of elaborate casualness that suggested he was approaching something of considerable importance by means of apparent irrelevance. "I wonder if I might trouble you for a tour of the house. Not the morning room itself, you understand. I shall come to that in due course, but the general geography of the place, where the servants sleep, where the kitchen is situated, which corridors connect to which rooms. You see, I have found that geography is often a more reliable witness than people, who do have such an unfortunate tendency to misremember details or indeed to forget entirely those aspects of their routine that have become so habitual as to seem invisible." Mrs. Ashworth, who seemed to be encountering in Lord Peter a manner of investigation rather at odds with her expectations, which had apparently run towards something involving more dramatic gestures and fewer questions about carpets and servants' habits, nevertheless rose and indicated her willingness to oblige. As she led him from the drawing-room and into the corridor beyond, Wimsey contrived to observe everything with a concentration that seemed almost excessive. He noted the position of the light switches, the thickness of the walls, the slight unevenness in the floorboards, and, most particularly, the precise location of a small painting of considerable antiquity that hung in the hallway, a portrait of what appeared to be a Tudor courtier, rendered in the manner of someone more competent than inspired. The kitchen, when they arrived at it, proved to be a room of considerable size, and, Wimsey observed with some amusement, of a cleanliness that bordered upon the obsessive. Everything was arranged with military precision, copper pots hung in day. Sending order of size, vegetables were stored in their appointed places with the organization of a well-run regiment, and the great coal-fired range gleamed with the patina of meticulous maintenance. Mrs. Craddock, the housekeeper, was a woman of perhaps 55, with the sort of face that suggested a lifetime spent in the service of the moderately well-to-do, without ever quite achieving contentment with the arrangement. She looked up from her work. She was preparing vegetables with the mechanical precision of one engaged in a task performed 10,000 times before, and her expression shifted from concentration to a wariness that Wimsey found rather illuminating. "Mrs. Craddock," he began, settling himself upon a stool with the casual intimacy of someone entirely unaware of social distinctions, "I wonder if I might inquire about your morning routine. Specifically, the preparation of Miss Weatherby's coffee. One understands it was a matter of considerable regularity." Mrs. Craddock set down her knife with deliberate care. "Every morning at 7:30 I begin the heating of water. At 20 minutes to 8 I place the coffee in the pot, ground coffee, mind you, fresh from the grocer in the village. Water is added at precisely 8 o'clock, and the pot is carried to the morning room where it is left upon the side table, along with a cup, a saucer, and a small jug of milk. Miss Weatherby preferred her coffee quite black, however, so the milk was rarely touched." "Fascinating," Wimsey observed, and there was something in his tone that suggested he found the recitation rather less than complete. "But tell me, Mrs. Craddock, in the course of this morning ritual, does the coffee pot ever leave your direct observation? Is it, for instance, left upon the kitchen table whilst you attend to other matters? Or does it travel directly from range to morning room in an ONB? Broken chain of custody, as it were." The housekeeper's jaw tightened almost imperceptibly. "It is carried immediately upon being poured. There is no opportunity for anyone to tamper with it, if that is what you are suggesting." "Oh, I am suggesting nothing whatsoever," Wimsey replied, with a smile of disarming innocence. "I am merely attempting to reconstruct the sequence of events with the precision that such matters require. You see, in my experience, the most reliable murders are those which rely upon routine. They exploit the predictability of human behavior with a sort of artistic elegance that one cannot help but admire from a purely theoretical perspective." He paused, allowing this observation to settle uncomfortably in the air. "Now, on the morning of Miss Weatherby's death, did anything deviate from this established routine? Any variation, however minor, in the timing or the procedure?" Mrs. Craddock hesitated, and in that hesitation Wimsey detected the presence of something being carefully weighed and measured before being committed to speech. "There was nothing unusual," she said finally, though the words emerged with all the conviction of a confession extracted under duress. "Everything proceeded precisely as always." "How very disappointing," Wimsey murmured, rising from his stool with the lazy grace of a cat extending itself. One had hoped for at least some minor deviation, a delayed kettle, a misplaced cup, a moment's distraction. But it seems Miss Weatherby was to be murdered by the very predictability that defined her existence. How rather symbolically apt, don't you think? He moved toward the window that overlooked the garden path leading to the morning room, his gaze apparently fixed upon the roses that struggled against the encroaching chill of autumn. "Tell me, this path here, does it pass beneath any windows of consequence? Windows through which one might observe the comings and goings of the household?" Mrs. Craddock followed his gaze with obvious confusion. "The morning room window overlooks the path, yes. Miss Weatherby often sat at her desk where she might observe the gardens. Then she might equally have been observed," Wimsey continued, half to himself, as though Mrs. Craddock were not present at all. One might stand at this very window, I should think, and track the movements of anyone approaching the morning room with considerable accuracy, particularly if one were accustomed to looking. He turned back to the housekeeper with an expression of elaborate politeness. Now, Mrs. Craddock, I find myself possessed of a quite terrible curiosity regarding the servants' hall. One understands there is a certain hierarchy among the staff, a structure of precedence and privilege that differs markedly from the formal arrangements of the house itself. I wonder if you might introduce me to Jenny. I should very much like to inquire whether she noticed anything unusual on the morning in question. Young eyes are often remarkably observant, even when their owners believe themselves to be inattentive. The housekeeper's expression suggested she found this request rather less than welcome, but she moved toward the servant's bell with the resignation of one accustomed to following orders, however oblique. As she did so, Wimsey's attention returned to the kitchen window, and there was something in the quality of his focus that suggested he had observed far more during their conversation than Mrs. Craddock's carefully measured words had revealed. Jenny appeared within 5 minutes, summoned from the scullery where she had been engaged in the methodical destruction of breakfast crockery. She was a girl of perhaps 22, with the sort of face that suggested a life spent in careful obscurity, not plain precisely, but wrath. Unremarkable, in a manner that made her instantly forgettable. Her hands, reddened from hot water and soap, twisted together with a nervous energy that suggested either guilt or an unfortunate predisposition toward anxiety in the presence of authority. Wimsey observed both phenomena with equal attention, filing away the distinction for later consideration. "Jenny," he began, with the sort of gentle courtesy that he employed toward those of the servant class, thereby consistently confounding their expectations of aristocratic indifference, "I wonder if you might assist me in reconstructing the events of the morning on which Miss Weatherby died. You attend to the fires in the morning room, I believe?" "Yes, sir," Jenny replied, her voice barely above a whisper. "Every morning at 7:30, I do. The fire in the morning room is lit first, before I attend to the other rooms, and on that particular morning, 3 days ago, was it not, did you observe anything unusual? Miss Weatherby, for instance, was she already in the room when you arrived?" "No, sir, she never is. She comes in at 8 o'clock, just as Mrs. Craddock brings the coffee. I always make certain to leave the room before she arrives, so as not to disturb her." Wimsey nodded, as though this were precisely the response he had anticipated. "But you must have heard the clock, surely, the house clock, the one in the hall, I presume, that chimes the hours. One hears it quite clearly throughout the house." Jenny hesitated, her fingers continuing their anxious rotation. "I did hear it, sir. 8 o'clock it was. I was just finishing with the hearth when I heard the bell." "And then?" Wimsey pressed gently. "What did you do?" "I gathered my things, the scuttle and the brush, and I left the room. I went down the corridor to attend to the fires in the drawing room and the study." "That is the usual routine, sir. ILW. Eyes do the morning room first, then the drawing room, then the study. A most sensible arrangement," Wimsey agreed, and something in his tone suggested genuine approbation. "Now, Jenny, I must ask you something of considerable delicacy. When you left the morning room on that particular morning, did you encounter anyone in the corridor? Anyone at all? Mrs. Craddock, perhaps, departing after having left the coffee, or any other member of the household?" The girl's face paled noticeably, and her hands stilled their agitated movement. "No, sir, I saw no one. The corridor was quite empty." "How very interesting," Wimsey observed, and he began to pace slowly around the kitchen with his hands clasped behind his back. One would have thought that at precisely 8 o'clock, when Mrs. Craddock was depositing the coffee and Jenny was departing with her fire-cleaning implements, the corridor might have been moderately active. Yet you suggest it was empty. Quite empty, in fact. No servants hurrying to and fro, no Mrs. Ashworth departing from her morning ablutions, no unexpected visitors?" "The household was quite quiet that morning, sir," Jenny said, and there was something in her voice that suggested she was reciting from memory, as though this answer had been prepared in advance. Wimsey paused in his pacing and fixed the girl with a gaze of such penetrating attention that she visibly flinched. "Jenny, I find myself wondering whether you are telling me the truth. Not because I believe you to be a habitual liar, one can usually detect such proclivities quite readily, but because there is something in your manner that suggests you are omitting rather than fabricating. A distinction of considerable importance, you understand. Now I am going to ask you again, and I am going to ask you to consider very carefully before answering. On the morning of Miss Weatherby's death, when you left the morning room at precisely 8 o'clock, did you or did you not encounter someone in the corridor? The silence that followed was broken only by the ticking of the kitchen clock and the distant sound of coal settling in the range. Jenny's eyes darted toward Mrs. Craddock, who stood rigidly by the table, her expression unreadable. Then, with the air of one making a confession of tremendous consequence, the girl spoke. "There was someone, sir. I did see someone. But they told me, that is to say, I was asked not to mention it. They said it would cause unnecessary trouble, and that it had nothing to do with what happened to Miss Weatherby." "Ah," Wimsey said softly. And there was a note of satisfaction in the syllable that suggested several pieces of a puzzle had suddenly aligned themselves in his mind. "And who, pray, was this someone who felt obliged to request your discretion?" "It was Mr. Ashworth, sir," Jenny whispered. "Miss Weatherby's nephew. He was just coming down the corridor from the direction of the morning room. He said he had come to visit his aunt, but that he preferred his arrival not be announced, as he wished to surprise her. He asked me to say nothing, and I agreed, sir. I didn't think it was wrong at the time." Mrs. Craddock made a small sound, something between a gasp and a suppressed exclamation. Wimsey, however, appeared entirely unsurprised by this revelation, as though it merely confirmed what he had already deduced from the pattern of dust upon the drawing-room mantelpiece, or some equally obscure piece of domestic minutiae. His expression, as he turned back to Jenny, contained no trace of triumph, only the faint shadow of something that might have been pity. Wimsey dismissed Jenny with a courtesy that seemed to surprise her more than any accusation might have done, and she departed the kitchen with evident relief, though her step was considerably less steady than it had been upon her arrival. Mrs. Craddock, left alone with him, maintained a posture of rigid composure, though her hands had resumed their anxious fidgeting with the vegetables that lay before her. Wimsey settled himself once more upon the stool, adopting an attitude of relaxed contemplation that would have seemed almost casual to anyone unfamiliar with the particular quality of his attention. "Mr. Ashworth," he said, as though the name had merely occurred to him as a matter of passing interest, "is, I take it, the son of Sir Humphrey Ashworth by a previous marriage. A man of independent means, I should imagine, or perhaps one dependent upon paternal largesse for the continuation of his lifestyle." "Mr. Ashworth is a man of considerable expectations," Mrs. Craddock replied, her voice tight as a drawn thread. "His father left him a substantial sum, though I confess I know little of his current circumstances. He does not visit Thornfield frequently, perhaps once or twice a year, usually without advance notice." "How very interesting," Wimsey observed. "A nephew who visits unannounced, yet feels sufficiently constrained to request the discretion of the household staff regarding his presence. One might wonder why a man should wish to arrive at his aunt's residence without fanfare, particularly if his relationship with Miss Weatherby was, as one might presume, entirely cordial. Unless, of course, it was not Miss Weatherby he sought to encounter in the morning room." Mrs. Craddock's hands stilled, and she lifted her head to regard Wimsey with an expression that contained elements of both defiance and resignation. "I don't know what you mean, sir, don't you?" Wimsey replied, rising from his stool with the fluid grace that seemed to contradict the languid manner of his speech. "I rather think you do, Mrs. Craddock. You have been in this household for considerably longer than Mr. Ashworth has been alive. That much is evident from your authority and the deference with which Mrs. Ashworth addresses you. You have observed the rhythms and patterns of this house with the meticulous attention of someone whose livelihood depends upon understanding the precise nature of her employer's requirements, and you have, I suspect, observed certain things regarding Mr. Ashworth and Miss Weatherby that suggested a relationship rather more intimate than that which might reasonably exist between a nephew and his aunt's companion." The housekeeper's face flushed a deep crimson, and her fingers clenched upon the knife she still held. "That is not a matter for public discussion, sir. Whatever may or may not have occurred between those two was their own affair." "Precisely so," Wimsey agreed, and his tone had acquired a note of unexpected gentleness. "And yet it becomes rather relevant when one of them is dead. poisoned in circumstances that would suggest premeditation and considerable knowledge of domestic routine. Tell me, Mrs. Craddock, how long has this affair, as you yourself have just confirmed it to be, been ongoing?" "I don't know," the housekeeper replied, her voice now barely audible. "Months, perhaps, maybe longer. They were careful. I noticed only because I know every corner of this house, every sound, every peculiarity of its rhythms. There were occasions when Mr. Ashworth would arrive late in the evening, when Mrs. Ashworth was occupied with her correspondence or her reading. He would stay in one of the guest rooms, and in the morning he would depart before the household was fully awake. Miss Weatherby would sometimes appear tired, distracted. It was not difficult to discern what was occurring, though I kept my counsel, as is proper. "How remarkably discreet of you," Wimsey observed. "And Mrs. Ashworth? Did she harbor suspicions regarding this arrangement?" "Mrs. Ashworth," Mrs. Craddock said, with a bitterness that suggested years of accumulated observation, "is a woman who sees only what she wishes to see. Miss Weatherby had become indispensable to her, a fixture of the household, almost invisible in the way of long-serving companions. Mrs. Ashworth would never have suspected such a thing, and if she had, she would never have acknowledged it. The scandal would have been insupportable." Wimsey returned to the window, his gaze once more fixed upon the garden path. "And yet," he mused, "scandal there has been, of a rather more dramatic variety. One might even suggest that scandal was the precise object of someone's intentions. Tell me, Mrs. Craddock, on the morning of Miss Weatherby's death, did Mr. Ashworth remain in the house, or did he depart early, as was apparently his custom?" "He left," Mrs. Craddock said quietly. "I heard his motor car departing at approximately 9 o'clock. Jenny heard it as well, I believe. He did not remain for breakfast." "How very convenient," Wimsey murmured, and there was something in the observation that suggested he found it anything but convenient. A man who arrives unannounced, requests discretion, encounters his lover in the morning room, at the precise moment coffee is being served, and then departs before the body has even begun to grow cold. One might almost think the entire affair had been choreographed with theatrical precision. He turned to face Mrs. Craddock once more, and his expression had acquired a quality of profound concentration. "Mrs. Craddock, I must ask you to do something of considerable delicacy. I require that you show me precisely where Mr. Ashworth typically stays when he visits Thornfield. Which guest room is his? And more importantly, has that room been disturbed or cleaned since his last visit?" The guest room designated. For Mr. Ashworth's occasional visits proved to be situated at the far end of the west corridor, a pleasant enough chamber furnished in the somewhat dated style that seemed to characterize the entirety of Thornfield Manor. It was decorated in shades of faded green and cream, with furnishings that spoke of late Victorian sensibilities rather refined into a sort of comfortable antiquity. The bed was made with military precision. The dressing table held nothing more remarkable than a hairbrush and a bottle of eau de cologne, and the wardrobe stood empty save for a spare blanket and several wire coat hangers of the sort that suggested long periods of vacancy. Yet it was upon the writing desk situated beneath the window that Wimsey's attention principally focused, for there, arranged with careful nonchalance, lay several items that appeared to have been deliberately left behind, or, more intriguingly, deliberately positioned for discovery. "Curious," Wimsey observed, his fingers hovering above the items without quite touching them. "Mrs. Craddock, when was this room last properly attended to? Not merely tidied, you understand, but thoroughly cleaned. Carpets swept, furnishings dusted, the window opened for ventilation." The day before Mr. Ashworth's arrival, Mrs. Craddock replied from the doorway, where she remained as though uncertain whether she ought to enter or withdraw. "Jenny prepares it always, though Mr. Ashworth rarely stays more than a single night. He insists upon privacy, and we do not disturb his quarters once he has retired." "And these items?" Wimsey gestured toward the desk, where there lay a fountain pen, a packet of cigarettes, Turkish by their appearance, and what appeared to be the remnants of several torn pages, as though someone had begun correspondence and thought better of it. "These have been here since his departure?" "I could not say with certainty." "Sir, the room has not been entered since that morning." Mr. Ashworth was quite particular about such matters. He preferred that we respect his privacy, and Mrs. Ashworth honored his wishes. Wimsey bent forward, his keen eyes examining the scattered pages without disturbing them. What fragments remained were largely illegible, consisting of partial sentences and abandoned attempts at composition. Yet one phrase caught his attention with sufficient force to cause him to pause. A single line that read, in handwriting that was distinctly agitated, "I cannot continue in this manner. She has discovered." The remainder of the sentence disappeared beneath a violent cross-hatching of ink, as though the writer had experienced sudden emotion and obliterated whatever had been written in a fit of frustrated passion. "Mrs. Craddock," Wimsey said, straightening and turning to face the housekeeper, "I find myself possessed of an uncomfortable suspicion. These pages, has anyone else examined them? Inspector Graves, for instance, when he conducted his investigation?" "No, sir." Inspector Graves confined his examination to Miss Weatherby's room and the morning room itself. He did not think to look in Mr. Ashworth's quarters. Indeed, he did not know that Mr. Ashworth had been present on the morning in question. Only Jenny knew, and she did not reveal it until you questioned her. "How very illuminating," Wimsey murmured. "And yet it raises certain questions of considerable importance. If Mr. Ashworth departed at 9 o'clock, and Miss Weatherby was discovered dead at approximately 9:30, when her breakfast tray was brought and found untouched, then we must consider what occurred in that intervening 30 minutes. You see, it would appear that Mr. Ashworth encountered Miss Weatherby in the morning room at 8 o'clock, at the precise moment the coffee was being delivered. He remained long enough to have conversation with her, perhaps to argue, perhaps merely to conduct his assigned rendezvous. But he departed before the poison took effect, or if he did not depart before, then someone else must have ensured that poison was delivered into the cup subsequent to his arrival." He moved toward the window and stood gazing out across the grounds with an expression of intense concentration. The autumn light was beginning to decline toward evening, casting long shadows across the manicured lawns and throwing the ancient oaks into silhouette. Now the question becomes, who administered the poison? And more importantly, why? For if Mr. Ashworth is not the culprit, and I confess I do not believe him to be, then we must look elsewhere for our murderer. Unless, of course, Mr. Ashworth is guilty precisely because he did not administer the poison himself, which would suggest a conspiracy of rather elegant complexity. "Sir," Mrs. Craddock ventured hesitantly, "are you suggesting that someone wished for Miss Weatherby to be discovered dead at a time when Mr. Ashworth could be implicated in her death, that the poison was meant to point toward him?" "I am suggesting nothing whatsoever at this juncture," Wimsey replied, though his expression contradicted this assertion entirely. "I am merely reconstructing possibilities and comparing them against the evidence available to us. However, there is one matter that troubles me considerably. This fountain pen upon the desk. It is not an inexpensive object. It appears to be a Mont Blanc. Quite a valuable item. One does not typically abandon such things in guest rooms unless one intended to return for them, or unless one had experienced some sudden disruption to one's plans. Tell me, was Mr. Ashworth accustomed to leaving personal items behind? Never, sir. He was meticulous about such matters. Whatever he brought, he took wit. Then we must conclude, Wimsey said, his voice acquiring a note of cold certainty, that Mr. Ashworth never had the opportunity to retrieve these items, which suggests that his departure from Thornfield was considerably less leisurely than Mrs. Craddock's account would have us believe. Indeed, I suspect that Mr. Ashworth left this house not at 9 o'clock in the ordinary manner, but rather in a state of considerable haste, prompted by something he had either discovered or experienced in the morning room at approximately 8:15 that morning. Wimsey descended the stairs with the deliberate slowness of a man engaged in profound calculation, his footsteps echoing through the corridor in a rhythm that seemed almost meditative. Mrs. Craddock followed at a respectful distance, her anxiety now palpable in every line of her posture. When they reached the entrance hall, Wimsey paused before the portrait of the Tudor courtier that he had observed earlier, studying it with an intensity that seemed disproportionate to what was, after all, merely a competent if uninspired work of portraiture. "Mrs. Craddock," he said, without turning from the painting, "I wonder if you might inform me regarding the provenance of this work. It appears to be of some antiquity, and yet I detect evidence of rather recent restoration along the frame. When was this undertaken?" The housekeeper appeared bewildered by the question. "I could not say precisely, sir. Mrs. Ashworth had it attended to approximately 18 months ago, I believe. She felt the frame had become shabby and required professional attention." "How very fastidious of her," Wimsey observed. "And did this restoration involve any alteration to the painting itself, or merely to the frame?" "Only the frame, sir. The canvas was left entirely untouched." Wimsey nodded, as though this answer confirmed something he had all read. "I suspected." He turned away from the portrait and continued toward the morning room, where the tragic events of the morning had unfolded. The room itself was precisely as Mrs. Ashworth had described it, south-facing, intimate, furnished with the kind of tasteful comfort that suggested a space designed for quiet contemplation. The writing desk at which Miss Weatherby had been discovered still bore evidence of her final correspondence, the letter remaining unfinished, the pen lying where it had fallen from her nerveless fingers. The coffee cup and pot had been removed by the police, but Wimsey moved about the room with the air of a man retracing a path already committed to memory. "The window," he said suddenly, pointing toward the south-facing casement that overlooked the garden. "It is ordinarily locked, I presume?" "Always, sir." Miss Weatherby was particular about such matters. She preferred privacy, and she was somewhat nervous regarding the possibility of intruders. "Interesting. And yet, observe the sill. There is a faint discoloration here, as though something had rested upon it recently. Something wet, perhaps, or something that had begun to corrode the paint. When was this window last properly cleaned?" "Not recently, sir. The exterior surfaces are attended to quarterly, when the weather permits. The interior is cleaned weekly, but there has been nothing unusual about the sill that I am aware of." Wimsey knelt before the window, his keen eyes tracing the minute irregularities in the paint. His fingers hovered above the sill without quite touching it, as though he were reading some invisible text inscribed upon its surface. "Mrs. Craddock, I must ask you a question of considerable delicacy, and I require that you answer with absolute honesty. Has Mrs. Ashworth experienced any recent difficulties of a financial nature, any indication that her circumstances might be in need of improvement, or that she harbored anxieties regarding her future security?" The housekeeper's face paled noticeably, and she seemed to struggle for several moments before responding. "Mrs. Ashworth has experienced some concerns regarding her income," she admitted finally. "Since Sir Humphrey's death, the estate has not performed as well as might have been hoped. There have been certain expenses, repairs to the roof, maintenance of the gardens, that have strained her resources considerably. She has not spoken of these matters directly, but I have heard her on the telephone with her solicitor discussing matters of finance and inheritance. And who would inherit Thornfield in the event of Mrs. Ashworth's death?" Wimsey asked, though his tone suggested he already knew the answer. "Mr. Ashworth, I believe. The estate was entailed upon him by his father's will, pending his mother's lifetime interest. Upon Mrs. Ashworth's death, it would pass directly to him." "How very convenient," Wimsey observed, rising to his feet with a fluidity that belied the intensity of his focus. "And Miss Weatherby? Did she possess any knowledge regarding these financial arrangements? Any understanding of the estate's precarious position?" "She would have known of it, sir, I expect. Companions are often privy to matters that other servants might not be. And Miss Weatherby was not merely a servant, she was a confidant of sorts, someone with whom Mrs. Ashworth would discuss her concerns and anxieties." Wimsey began to pace the room with measured steps, his fingers pressed together in that characteristic gesture that preceded moments of pronounced intellectual concentration. "Mrs. Craddock, I believe I have been approaching this matter from an entirely incorrect angle. I have been presuming that Mr. Ashworth was the intended victim of some elaborate scheme, that the poisoned coffee repré scented an attempt to implicate him in Miss Weatherby's death. But what if, in fact, the reverse were true? What if Miss Weatherby's death was the intended consequence, and Mr. Ashworth's presence in the morning room at that critical moment was entirely fortuitous?" "I don't understand, sir." "Don't you?" Wimsey replied, and there was something almost melancholy in his expression. "Then allow me to elucidate. Miss Weatherby was a woman of considerable familiarity with this household. She understood the routines, the rhythms, the patterns of daily life. She knew that the coffee would arrive at 8 o'clock. She knew that Mrs. Ashworth would eventually be forced into financial ruin, at which point Miss Weatherby's position as companion would become untenable. And she may well have known other things pertaining to her relationship with young Mr. Ashworth that had begun to acquire a certain gravity and consequence that required resolution. You see, Mrs. Craddock, if Miss Weatherby was expecting a child, a condition that would have rendered her situation utterly impossible in a household such as this, she might have decided that a premature departure from life would be preferable to the scandal and humiliation that would inevitably ensue. The housekeeper made a small sound of distress. "You believe that Miss Weatherby poisoned herself? That she deliberately consumed arsenic knowing that it would kill her?" "I believe," Wimsey said quietly, "that matters are considerably more complex than such a simple explanation would suggest. But if you wish to understand what truly occurred in this room 3 days ago, I shall require access to Dr. Henley's medical examination. For I suspect he made a discovery that he did not fully appreciate at the time. Dr. Henley's surgery was situated in the village of Thornfield Cross, a modest establishment of grey stone and leaded windows, that suggested decades of country practice and the accumulated wisdom, or accumulated prejudice, that such a tenure inevitably produced. The doctor himself proved to be a man of perhaps 60 years with a sort of face that had been weathered by Sussex winds and the unfortunate tendency of rural patients to delay seeking medical attention until the point of crisis had been substantially exceeded. He received Wimsey with the wariness of a man accustomed to being questioned by authorities, but somewhat discomfited by the prospect of being questioned by a peer of the realm, who appeared to understand medicine with an intimacy that suggested either professional training or an unusually comprehensive autodidactic education. "Lord Peter," Dr. Henley began, settling himself behind his desk with the air of one preparing for an interrogation, "I confess I am somewhat puzzled by your visit. Inspector Graves has already examined my findings regarding Miss Weatherby's death most thoroughly. The case appears to be straightforward. Arsenic poisoning, administered through the medium of her morning coffee. The woman consumed a lethal dose, experienced the inevitable symptoms of such poisoning, and expired within a matter of hours. It is a tragedy, certainly, but not an uncommon method of suicide among women who find themselves in desperate circumstances." "Suicide," Wimsey repeated, his eyebrows rising with an expression of theatrical surprise. "How very interesting that you should arrive at that conclusion, Dr. Henley. And yet, when one examines the medical evidence with any degree of rigor, one discovers that suicide by arsenic poisoning is considerably less common among women of Miss Weatherby's station than one might suppose. For you see, arsenic is a poison that demands a certain brutal determination. It does not produce a gentle or particularly dignified departure from life. Tell me, did Miss Weatherby's medical examination reveal any evidence of pregnancy?" The doctor's face flushed a deep crimson, and his fingers clenched upon the edge of his desk. "That is a matter of considerable delicacy, Lord Peter. The examination was conducted privately, and the findings were not made public, nor indeed disclosed to the local constabulary, as I felt the revelation would serve no purpose save to sully the reputation of a deceased woman and cause unnecessary distress to her family." "How admirably discreet of you," Wimsey observed, with a tone that suggested his admiration was not unmixed with criticism. "And yet discretion, while undoubtedly commendable in its proper place, can become a liability when it serves to obscure the truth regarding a matter of such profound consequence. Miss Weatherby was indeed with child, was she not?" "She was," Dr. Henley admitted, his voice acquiring a note of weary resignation. "Approximately 4 months along, if my examination was accurate. The condition would have become apparent within a matter of weeks, given her circumstances, unmarried, employed as a companion, without family or independent means. Her situation was indeed desperate. And yet, Wimsey continued, rising from his chair and beginning to pace the small surgery with the restless energy of a man possessed of knowledge that demanded articulation, the nature of Miss Weatherby's death suggests something rather more complex than simple suicide born of desperation. You see, Dr. Henley, a woman who is determined to end her life in such a manner typically exhibits certain signs, hesitation marks, as it were, in the form of self-inflicted wounds or partial consumption of poison, followed by panic and attempts at recovery. The ingestion of a lethal dose suggests either profound determination or, more intriguingly, the belief that one is consuming something other tea. A fatal poison. What are you suggesting, Lord Peter? Dr. Henley inquired, and there was something in his expression that suggested he was beginning to comprehend the direction of Wimsey's reasoning. I am suggesting, Wimsey replied, that Miss Weatherby's death may not have been suicide at all, but rather murder most carefully disguised. A murder executed by someone who understood her circumstances with profound intimacy, who knew that her condition would render her desperate, and who calculated that any investigation into her death would conclude that she had taken her own life to escape an intolerable situation. Tell me, Dr. Henley, when you conducted your examination, did you observe any evidence of forced consumption? Any lacerations to the lips or tongue that might suggest that Miss Weatherby had resisted drinking the poisoned beverage? There was nothing of the sort, the doctor replied slowly. The poison appeared to have been consumed willingly, almost eagerly. Her stomach contents suggested that she had drunk a substantial quantity of the coffee before the effects of the arsenic began to manifest. Then we arrive at the crux of the matter, Wimsey said, his voice acquiring an edge of cold certainty. Miss Weatherby consumed the poisoned coffee, believing it to be ordinary coffee laced, perhaps, with some substance intended to induce miscarriage, a common enough remedy sought by women in her predicament, whether obtained from a chemist or from some less scrupulous practitioner of folk medicine. She did not know that what she was consuming would kill her. She believed, quite reasonably, that she was taking medication intended to address her pregnancy, and in that belief, she drank the coffee and sealed her fate. Dr. Henley's face had acquired a greyish pallor, and his hands trembled slightly as he pressed them together upon his desk. If what you jesting is true, Lord Peter, then someone deliberately manipulated Miss Weatherby's desperation into an instrument of her own death. Someone gave her reason to believe that relief was at hand, and then ensured that relief took the form of poison. Precisely so, Wimsey agreed. And the question that now presents itself is this: who possessed the knowledge of Miss Weatherby's condition, the opportunity to administer a substitute substance in place of whatever legitimate medication she might have sought, and the motive to ensure her permanent silence regarding certain matters that would inevitably have become apparent as her pregnancy advanced. For you see, Dr. Henley, Miss Weatherby was not merely carrying a child. She was carrying a child whose father was a man of property and expectation, a man whose inheritance was contingent upon the maintenance of respectability, and whose current financial circumstances made the prospect of scandal quite literally untenable. Wimsey returned to Thornfield Manor as the evening light was beginning its final descent into twilight, casting the ancient oaks into silhouette and transforming the red brick of the house into something resembling dried blood. He found Mrs. Ashworth in the drawing-room, engaged in needlework with the mechanical precision of someone performing an action entirely divorced from conscious thought. She looked up as he entered, her needle pausing mid-stitch, and something in her expression suggested that she had been expecting his return, or more precisely, that she had been dreading it with the intensity of someone who recognizes that a reckoning is approaching and cannot be indefinitely postponed. Mrs. Ashworth, Wimsey began, settling himself into a chair with the casual intimacy of someone entirely unaware of the social implications of his manner, I find myself possessed of several questions that require words of considerable specificity. I wonder if you might indulge me in what may seem like peculiar inquiries regarding household management and domestic routine. Of course, Lord Peter, Mrs. Ashworth replied, though her voice had acquired a brittleness that suggested considerable strain. I have endeavored to provide you with every assistance in your investigation. How admirable, Wimsey observed, Then permit me to begin by inquiring regarding your knowledge of medical practitioners in the vicinity. Does Miss Weatherby ever consult with anyone regarding matters of a personal nature? A woman physician, perhaps, or a specialist in female complaints? Mrs. Ashworth's needle resumed its motion, though the stitches now appeared considerably less precise than they had been. Miss Weatherby was a woman of considerable self-reliance. She would not have consulted anyone regarding such matters unless absolutely necessary. She preferred to manage such concerns privately, through correspondence or through the acquisition of remedies obtained discreetly through the chemist. "And you would have known of such acquisitions," Wimsey pressed gently. "A woman does not live in intimate proximity with another for 15 years without acquiring considerable knowledge of her private habits and concerns. One becomes aware of such things," Mrs. Ashworth admitted reluctantly, "though I confess I made a deliberate effort not to inquire too closely into matters that Miss Weatherby clearly wished to keep private. It seemed the decent thing to do, to allow her the dignity of her own secrets." "How very scrupulous of you," Wimsey said, and there was something in his tone that suggested his admiration was entirely genuine. "And yet I wonder whether that same discretion extended to other matters, such as, for instance, Miss Weatherby's relationship with your stepson, Mr. Ashworth. One presumes you were aware of the nature of their connection?" The needle fell from Mrs. Ashworth's fingers and clattered upon the floor. She did not attempt to retrieve it, but instead sat with her hands folded in her lap, her eyes fixed upon some point in the middle distance. When she spoke, her voice had acquired a quality of hollow resignation. "I knew. I had suspected for some months." One cannot live in a house and fail to observe such things, despite one's best efforts at willful blindness. "And how did that knowledge affect you?" Wimsey continued, with a gentleness that seemed almost cruel in its penetration. "Did you experience feelings of betrayal, of jealousy, perhaps, or anger at what you perceived as ingratitude from a woman to whom you had offered employment and shelter?" "I felt many things," Mrs. Ashworth replied quietly. "Betrayal was among them, disappointment, a sense that I had been made a fool of in my own house. But I said nothing, because to speak would have been to acknowledge something that was quite literally unspeakable. Within the context of this household and this society, one does not accuse one's stepson of seduction, particularly when the seduced party is a woman of no family and no prospects. The scandal would have destroyed everything. His reputation, my social standing, the very fabric of civilized life as I had known it. And then, Wimsey observed, circumstances changed. Miss Weatherby became pregnant. That condition would have rendered her situation not merely improper, but catastrophic. It would have become known eventually. There would have been no possible excuse, no way to preserve respectability or to avoid the complete and utter social destruction that such a revelation would entail. Mrs. Ashworth's composure began to fragment, tears spilling silently down her cheeks. "She came to me 3 weeks ago. She told me she was with child and that she was desperate. She asked if I could assist her in obtaining something, a remedy, medication, anything that might address her condition before it became apparent to the household. She was terrified, Lord Peter. She believed her life was over, that she would be cast out into the street, that she would die in poverty and disgrace." "And what did you tell her?" Wimsey asked, his voice dropping to barely above a whisper. "I told her I would help her," Mrs. Ashworth said, and her voice had acquired a quality of deadened finality. "I told her I knew of a chemist in London who dealt in such matters discreetly. I said I would obtain something for her, and that we would keep it between ourselves. I never told her what I obtained. I simply prepared the coffee that morning, added the substance to it, left it on the side table as I always did, and returned to my chambers to dress for the day. I did not know she was dead until Jenny came to find me at 9:30. Wimsey rose from his chair and walked to the window, his silhouette outlined against the fading light. When he spoke, his voice carried a weight that seemed to compress the entire room into a smaller, darker space. "You did not give her medication, Mrs. Ashworth. You gave her arsenic. You obtained it under the pretext of seeking a remedy for her condition, and you administered it with the certain knowledge of what would result. You did not intend to save her from scandal. You intended to ensure her permanent silence." Miss Weatherby's death was not the consequence of her desperation, but the direct and deliberate result of your actions. Mrs. Ashworth made no attempt to deny it. She simply sat in her chair, her hands folded, her expression empty of everything save a terrible, consuming despair. Inspector Graves arrived at Thornfield Manor shortly after 9 o'clock the following morning, summoned by telegram and bearing with him the air of a man who has been obliged to reconsider conclusions that he had felt certain enough to commit to his official report. He was accompanied by a sergeant of considerably less impressive demeanor, whose principal function appeared to be the carrying of documents and the maintenance of an expression of professional neutrality in the face of aristocratic involvement in police matters. Wimsey received them in the study with the courtesy that he extended to all representatives of law enforcement regardless of their intellectual capacities, and proceeded to lay out with meticulous precision the chain of reasoning that had led him to conclusions so dramatically at odds with the inspector's own. "You see, Inspector," Wimsey began, gesturing toward a series of notes he had arranged upon the desk with characteristic orderliness, "the fundamental error in your investigation lay not in what you examined, but in what you failed to examine with sufficient rigor. The coffee pot was indeed innocent. No traces of arsenic could be detected upon it because the poison was never administered through that medium. Instead, it was added directly to the cup at the moment of serving, by someone with access to the morning room and intimate knowledge of Miss Weatherby's habits. But the cup was examined," Graves protested, his face acquiring the defensive expression of a man whose professional competence was being called into question. "There was no evidence of tampering, no residue upon the rim, nothing whatsoever to suggest that poison had been introduced after the coffee was poured." "Precisely so," Wimsey agreed. "Which brings us to the question of how poison might be introduced into a cup of coffee in such a manner as to leave no visible evidence. The answer, you see, lies in the employment of a substance that is both soluble and, when dissolved in hot liquid, entirely indistinguishable from the beverage itself. Arsenic, when properly administered in solution form, possesses precisely these characteristics. One need merely add it to the cup moments before the coffee is poured, allow it to dissolve in the heat of the liquid, and the evidence of tampering becomes invisible to all but the most thorough chemical analysis." Graves' expression suggested that this explanation was not entirely satisfying to him, but he made notes in a leather-bound notebook with the meticulous care of a man attempting to record facts that he did not entirely comprehend. "And you are certain that Mrs. Ashworth administered this poison? She has not confessed to the crime, though she has admitted to knowledge of Miss Weatherby's condition and to purchasing a substance through a London chemist." "She has not confessed in explicit terms," Wimsey conceded, "but her silence on the matter is itself a form of confession. You see, Inspector, a woman who had genuinely believed she was providing medication for a desperate companion would have immediately protested her innocence when confronted with the reality of Miss Weatherby's death. She would have insisted upon her good intentions, her belief that she was assisting in a legitimate medical matter. Instead, Mrs. Ashworth has chosen to remain silent regarding the specific nature of the substance she obtained from her London contacts, which suggests that she knew precisely what she was providing and precisely what consequences would result from its administration." "But what of motive?" Graves inquired, his tone acquiring the note of a man grasping at straws. "You have suggested that Mrs. Ashworth was motivated by a desire to avoid scandal, but that seems an innate, quaint foundation for such a serious crime. Surely there were other options available to her. She might have encouraged Miss Weatherby to leave the household or arranged for her to go abroad until the child was born and could be given over to adoption or some other arrangement." "You are quite right," Wimsey acknowledged, "and yet you fail to comprehend the particular psychology of a woman in Mrs. Ashworth's position. You see, Inspector, Mrs. Ashworth is a woman whose entire identity is bound up in her social position and respectability. She is a widow of modest means, residing in a house that she cannot afford to maintain, dependent upon the goodwill of relatives and the deference of her servants for her continued security. The revelation that her stepson had fathered a child upon her companion would have destroyed her irrevocably. Not merely her reputation, but her financial security as well. For what gentleman of standing would have continued to show favor to a woman presiding over such a household? What respectable family would have maintained social connections with her? She would have been cast out, made an object of pity and contempt. In her mind, the elimination of Miss Weatherby and her unborn child was not a crime of passion, but rather a necessity, a brutal solution to an impossible problem. "You speak with considerable sympathy for the criminal," Graves observed, with a note of something that might have been criticism or might merely have been observation. "I speak with understanding," Wimsey corrected gently, which is not the same thing as sympathy, though I confess the two are often confused. "I understand the terrible logic that drove Mrs. Ashworth to her desperate act. I comprehend the fears and the social pressures that made murder seem, to her mind, a preferable alternative to scandal and social destruction. And yet understanding does not alter the fun. The mental nature of what she has done. She has committed murder, premeditated, calculated, and executed with a coldness that speaks to a woman who had convinced herself of the necessity of her actions. The sergeant, who had remained silent throughout this exposition, shifted uncomfortably and cleared his throat. Graves rose to his feet with the air of a man preparing himself for an unpleasant duty. "I shall require a formal statement from Mrs. Ashworth," he said, with the tone of one reading from a script composed by forces beyond his immediate control, "and I shall need to contact the London chemist to confirm the nature of the substance she obtained. If what you have suggested proves to be accurate, Lord Peter, then we have a case of deliberate poisoning that will require the most serious consideration by the Crown prosecutors." "I have no doubt it will receive such consideration," Wimsey replied, with a weariness that suggested he had been through precisely such proceedings numerous times before and found them uniformly distasteful. "Mrs. Ashworth was discovered in her bedroom at approximately 10:30 that morning, having taken the precaution of consuming the remainder of the arsenic that she had retained after administering the fatal dose to Miss Weatherby." The irony was not lost upon Wimsey, who observed the scene with the detached expression of a man witnessing the final act of a tragedy whose ending had been written long before its commencement. Inspector Graves, when informed of this development, acquired the expression of a man who has been relieved of a considerable burden, though whether that relief was motivated by the elimination of the necessity for a trial or by the simple fact that the case had achieved a resolution was a matter upon which Wimsey chose not to speculate. The house fell into a peculiar silence following Mrs. Ashworth's death, this hour of silence that attends upon great scandal and social catastrophe. The servants, who had served in the household for years, scattered like leaves before an autumn wind, seeking employment elsewhere before association with the crime might taint their own prospects for future engagement. Mrs. Craddock alone remained, and it was she who met Wimsey in the drawing-room on the afternoon following Mrs. Ashworth's demise, her face bearing the grey pallor of someone who has witnessed the complete dissolution of the world as she had known it. "I cannot help but feel responsible, Lord Peter," she said, her voice barely audible. "Had I spoken sooner regarding the relationship between Miss Weatherby and Mr. Ashworth, might not this tragedy have been prevented?" "You are not responsible," Wimsey replied, with a gentleness that seemed almost at odds with his ordinarily sardonic demeanor. Mrs. Ashworth's actions were her own, born of her own fears and her own particular understanding of what circumstances demanded. You could not have prevented this tragedy any more than I could have, had I arrived a day earlier. Some events, Mrs. Craddock, possess an inevitability that transcends the possibilities of intervention. Miss Weatherby was doomed from the moment she allowed herself to become pregnant by a man whose social position made such a relationship utterly untenable. Mrs. Ashworth was doomed from the moment she allowed herself to believe that murder was a preferable alternative to scandal, and Mr. Ashworth was doomed to carry the knowledge of these events for the remainder of his life, knowing that his thoughtlessness and his weakness had set in motion the chain of circumstances that resulted in 2 deaths. He rose and walked to the window, gazing out across the gardens where the autumn leaves were now falling with increasing frequency, carpeting the ground in shades of rust and gold. "You see, Mrs. Craddock, what we call detective work is in reality the tracing of human nature to its logical conclusions. People do not commit crimes in a vacuum. They commit them because they have been driven to desperation by circumstances, or because they have convinced themselves that such actions are justified. or because they have become so enmeshed in their own lies and self-deceptions that they can no longer distinguish between right and wrong. Mrs. Ashworth was not a wicked woman by nature. She was simply a woman who had been confronted with an impossible situation and who chose, in her moment of crisis, to respond with violence rather than with courage or compassion. Inspector Graves departed Thornfield Manor the following morning, his official report filed, and his professional obligations satisfied. He left behind him the residue of investigation, the disrupted household, the questioning of servants, the examination of documents and correspondence that had revealed the correspondence between Mrs. Ashworth and certain disreputable practitioners of dubious chemical sciences in London's East End. The case would be closed, the scandal would gradually fade from public memory, and life would continue its steady progression forward, carrying with it the memory of these events like a stone worn smooth by the passage of time. Wimsey himself lingered at Thornfield Manor for one additional day, ostensibly to provide any final assistance that might be required, but in reality because he had acquired a certain affection for the place despite, or perhaps because of, the darkness that had been revealed within its walls. He spent the afternoon walking through the gardens, observing the progress of the seasons and contemplating the nature of human weakness and moral compromise. It was there, standing before the rose garden that Miss Weatherby had so carefully tended, that he was approached by a young man whom he recognized immediately as Mr. Ashworth, despite the fact that they had never been formally introduced. "Lord Peter," the young man began, his voice trembling with barely suppressed emotion, "I wanted to thank you for your work in this matter. I know that my role in these events was peripheral, but I also know that the truth regarding Arabella's death and my mother's actions will inevitably become known, and I believe I owe it to you to understand precisely what occurred." Wimsey regarded him with an expression of considerable sympathy, though his eyes remained as penetrating as ever. "You were caught, Mr. Ashworth, between the demands of passion and the constraints of social propriety. Miss Weatherby was a woman of considerable intelligence and warmth, and it is entirely understandable that you found yourself attracted to her despite the obvious impossibility of any future together. What occurred between you was not in itself a crime, merely a human failing born of desire and circumstance. The true crime was committed by a woman who allowed herself to believe that your indiscretion justified her response. I should have been more careful," Ashworth said bitterly. "I should have recognized the impossible position in which my actions had placed Arabella. I should have—" "You should have," Wimsey agreed, "but you did not, and now you must live with the knowledge of what your carelessness has produced. That, Mr. Ashworth, is a burden that will not diminish with time, though you may eventually learn to carry it without allowing it to crush you entirely." As Wimsey departed Thornfield Manor in the late afternoon, his motor-car winding along the drive beneath the ancient oaks, he found himself thinking not of the crime that had been solved, but of the lives that had been destroyed in its commission. Mrs. Ashworth, driven by desperate iron and social terror to an act of murder and then to suicide. Miss Weatherby, destroyed not by her own weakness but by the weakness of others, and Mr. Ashworth, condemned to live with the knowledge of his own culpability in these tragedies, forever marked by events that had transpired in a single moment of unguarded passion. It was as he was crossing the village green that Wimsey observed the church, its stone walls weathered by centuries of English rain and wind, and he found himself drawn to pause for a moment in contemplation. The inscription above the door read, in letters worn almost to invisibility by time, a passage from Dante, "Abandon all hope, ye who enter here." He smiled at this observation, not the hopeful sentiment that one ordinarily associated with places of worship, but rather a reminder that even in our desperate attempts to construct meaning and order, we remain subject to forces beyond our control. Crime, he reflected, was not really a matter of good and evil in any absolute sense. It was rather the manifestation of human weakness, human desperation, and human failure to transcend the limitations of our own nature. And detective work was simply the process of tracing these failures back to their source and holding them up to the light for examination. Whether such examination produced justice or merely illumination was a matter upon which reasonable people could disagree.